So, here's the deal. Last night, everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down. Literally, because I was crouched on a rooftop in the rain, camera in hand, watching a mark for a surveillance op. I'm a detective, have been for 10 years. But this case? This one wasn't just about the perp, it was about me. I was tailing one of Armando Lowe's lieutenants, a guy named Diego. Armando Lowe isn't your run-of-the-mill crime boss. He's calculated, terrifying, and has half the department in his pocket. We've been working for years to bring his operation down, and now, we were so close I could taste it. All I had to do was record Diego meeting his contact. But then I got a call. It was Rachel, my wife. I was supposed to be working late, so I didn't expect her to call unless it was urgent. I answered in a whisper, rain dripping off my hood. "Nick," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk. Now." I whispered, my eyes still on Diego. "I'm in the middle of something." "It's important," she insisted. I can't keep doing this." I sighed. Rachel and I had been off for months. She said I was married to my job, and maybe she wasn't wrong. "Can it wait?" I asked. "I'm at your brother's place," she said. "Come when you can." I froze. My brother, Kyle, and I haven't exactly been close, but Rachel never mentioned hanging out with him. "Why are you there?" I asked, my voice sharpening. There was a long pause. Then she said, "It's complicated." I wanted to press her, but Diego moved suddenly, pulling me back into the moment. "I'll call you later," I said and hung up, my mind buzzing. But I couldn't focus on Rachel. Not yet. Work came first, always had. Diego met his contact, a young woman with a briefcase, and exchanged a quick handshake. I snapped a few photos, making sure to capture their faces. Then my partner, Jake, buzzed in my earpiece. "All clear." "All clear," I replied. "Let's wrap it up." By the time I got to my car, the storm was really picking up. I sat there, staring at my phone, debating if I should call Rachel back. But something told me I needed answers face to face. So I drove straight to Kyle's. The house was dark except for the living room window. I parked a block away and walked up quietly, the rain masking my steps. Through the window, I saw them, Rachel and Kyle, sitting too close on the couch. Her hand was on his arm, and he was leaning in, his face serious. I should have walked in right then. But I didn't. Instead, I stood in the rain, staring at them, and wondering if everything I feared was true. I don't know how long I stood there. Time just sort of stopped as I watched Rachel laugh softly at something Kyle said, her hand still resting on his arm like it belonged there. My breath fogged the glass, and I realized how stupid I must look, a grown man hiding outside his brother's house, soaking wet, instead of walking in and demanding answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way they were acting, like there was nothing to hide. No frantic movements, no nervous glances toward the door. They looked too comfortable, too natural. And maybe that was the part that hurt the most. I forced myself to step back. My gut said I wasn't ready for this, not without more information. Call it the detective in me. I turned and walked back to my car, each step heavy with doubt and anger. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, but I couldn't go home. Not yet. Instead, I parked a few blocks down and made a call. Not to Rachel, not to Kyle, but to Jake, my partner. "Nick," he answered, groggy. "What's up?" "We just finished the surveillance." "I need a favor," I said, my voice tight. Jake paused, like he could sense something was wrong. "What kind of favor?" "Run a trace on my wife's phone," I said. "Find out who she's been texting, calling, anything." Jake sighed. "Nick, you sure about this? That's crossing some lines, man." "I'm sure," I snapped, sharper than I intended. "Please, Jake. Just do it." There was silence on the line. Then reluctantly he said, "Give me an hour." I hung up and sat there in the car, watching the rain streak down the windshield. My stomach churned as I thought about what I'd just done. Spying on Rachel? It wasn't exactly ethical. But neither was sneaking off to my brother's house at night for whatever complicated thing she couldn't tell me over the phone. Jake called back exactly 57 minutes later. "You're not gonna like this," he said. "Just tell me. Her most frequent contact is Kyle." He hesitated. "They've been texting nonstop for months. Calls too. Some of them are short, but others are an hour or more. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. What else? Jake sighed. A lot of the messages are deleted. Can't recover those without her phone, but judging by the timestamps, they were late at night. Way past normal hours. I clenched my jaw, staring at the rain-slick street in front of me. Anything else? There's another name that keeps popping up, Jake said. Captain Delaney. That caught me off guard. Delaney? My CO. Yeah, Jake confirmed. Texts and calls, though not as frequent as Kyle. Could be work-related, but thought you'd want to know. I didn't say anything for a long moment. My brother, my wife, and now my commanding officer? It was like the universe was laughing at me, throwing every betrayal possible in my face. Nick, Jake said cautiously, maybe you should take a step back. This feels personal. You need a clear head. Thanks, Jake, I muttered and hung up. I went home after that, though home didn't feel like the right word anymore. Rachel was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her, and wondering how long she'd been lying to me. Weeks? Months? Years? I thought about waking her up, forcing her to explain. But what was the point? She'd deny it, twist the story, make me feel like I was crazy. I knew her well enough to predict every word she'd say. So I let her sleep. But I didn't. I stayed up all night, piecing together everything I'd learned. Kyle. Rachel. Delaney. I didn't have the full picture yet, but the pieces I had were enough to tell me one thing. They weren't just betraying me. They were underestimating me. And that was a mistake I wouldn't let them make again. The next morning felt like stepping into a bad dream that wouldn't end. Rachel was in the kitchen, dressed like nothing had happened. She had this airy smile as she poured her coffee, like she wasn't living a double life. For a split second, I wondered if I was wrong about her. Maybe Jake's information was a coincidence, a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. Morning, she said casually, glancing up at me. I didn't answer. I just stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman I married with the one sneaking around with my brother. She noticed my silence, hesitated, then filled the gap with chatter. I've got a lot to do today, she said, stirring cream into her coffee. Errands, grocery shopping, maybe a yoga class. You working late again? Yeah, I muttered, barely looking at her. She nodded, her eyes searching mine for something. Guilt? Concern? I couldn't tell. Before I could press, my phone buzzed. It was Jake. Work, I said quickly and stepped into the living room to answer. You sitting down? Jake asked. Just tell me, I said, bracing myself. Your brother's name popped up again. He made a call to Captain Delaney last week, right before a major ops briefing. Pretty unusual for a civilian to have direct access to the captain. I gritted my teeth. Any idea what they talked about? No, but it doesn't look good, Jake said. And there's more. Someone's been running checks on you through department records. Accessing your personnel file, your case logs. It's all linked back to Delaney's credentials. I sank into the couch, my mind racing. Why the hell would Delaney be digging into my files? Jake hesitated. Could be prepping to burn you. Covering his tracks if something goes sideways. Maybe Kyle's feeding him info. I don't know, Nick. But it's clear this isn't just about your wife. There's a bigger game here. When I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. This wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore. It was professional, too. My commanding officer, my brother, and my wife, 3 people who should have had my back, were playing a game I didn't fully understand yet. But if they thought I'd sit back and take it, they didn't know me at all. I decided to keep playing dumb for now. Let them think I was oblivious. The more they believed I didn't know, the more I could use it to my advantage. If there was one thing I'd learned as a detective, it was this: patience always paid off. Over the next few days, I started digging. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Rachel went about her day like nothing was wrong, but I noticed her checking her phone more often, slipping off to take calls in the other room. Kyle didn't reach out, which wasn't surprising. We weren't close enough for him to pretend he cared about me. But Delaney? That was a different story. He called me into his office the day after Jake's tip, acting friendly as always. Nick, he said, leaning back in his chair. How's the low case coming along? Slow, I lied. Diego's careful. But we're making progress. He nodded thoughtfully, but there was something off about his demeanor. Too casual. Too rehearsed. "Let me know if you hit any roadblocks," he said, his tone almost sympathetic. "I want to make sure you've got everything you need." I left his office with my skin crawling. Delaney was up to something, and I needed to figure out what before he made his move. That night, I went through Rachel's phone while she was in the shower. I hadn't planned on it, but I saw it sitting there on the nightstand, and curiosity got the better of me. She'd been careful, no incriminating texts, no suspicious calls. But she wasn't as smart as she thought. In her calendar, I found an entry for Friday night. Dinner, 8 p.m. Kyle. I put the phone back and stepped away, my heart pounding. Dinner with my brother? While I was working late again. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. But instead of confronting her, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was exactly what I needed, a chance to catch them in the act. On Friday, I told Rachel I'd be working another late shift. She didn't even blink, just kissed me on the cheek and told me to stay safe. I followed her that night, careful to keep my distance. She drove across town to a small Italian restaurant, the kind of place we used to go to when we were dating. The thought made my stomach churn. She walked in alone, but it didn't take long for Kyle to show up. He greeted her with a hug, too long, too familiar, and they took a corner booth. I parked across the street, watching through the rain-streaked windows. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language said enough. Leaning in close, laughing like nothing else mattered. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hand steady despite the rage boiling inside me. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about leverage. If they wanted to play games, I'd make sure I was the one holding all the cards. The restaurant was dim, but I didn't need bright lights to see what was happening. Kyle and Rachel sat close, too close, their heads tilted toward each other like they were the only two people in the world. Her laugh was soft, her smile easy. I couldn't believe how natural they looked together, like this wasn't a betrayal but just normal. My phone vibrated. It was Jake. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Not even close," I said, my eyes fixed on the booth. "You need backup?" "Not for this." I hung up and stayed in the car, watching them through the window. They ordered wine. She reached across the table, brushing Kyle's hand like it was nothing. He didn't pull away. For a second, I thought about barging in, flipping their table, and demanding answers right then and there. But I stayed put. I needed more than anger, I needed proof. After about an hour, they paid the bill and left together. I tailed them as they walked to Kyle's car. He opened the door for her, another move too personal for comfort. She didn't hesitate before sliding in. When the car pulled out, I followed at a safe distance. They weren't going back to her place or his. Instead, they headed for the motel just outside of town, the one with a flickering neon sign. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was real. Kyle parked, and they walked into the lobby together. I sat in the car, staring at the door they disappeared behind, the weight of it all crushing down on me. But I didn't move. Not yet. Instead, I made a decision. Let them think they've won. Let them dig their hole even deeper. Because when the time comes, I'll bury them in it. The motel door stayed closed, the curtains drawn. I sat in my car, the rain tapping on the windshield like some cruel metronome, keeping time as everything fell apart. I thought about going in, forcing them to face me right then and there. But what would that do? Give them an excuse? Let them paint me as the crazy one? No. That's what they'd want. Instead, I drove off. My heart pounded, but my mind was clear. I wasn't just Nick, the betrayed husband. I was Detective Nicholas Carter, and I knew how to handle snakes. The next morning, Rachel acted like nothing had happened. She smiled, made breakfast, and asked about my work. "You seem distracted," she said, tilting her head in mock concern. "I'm fine," I replied, sipping my coffee. "Just tired." I'd spent the night piecing together my plan. The photos I took were good, but I needed more. Something irrefutable. Something that tied Kyle, Rachel, and Delaney into one neat, damning package. Jake called later that afternoon. "You good?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I need another favor," I said. "Nick, you're pushing it," he warned. "I know, but this one's big. Can you pull Kyle's financials? I need to see where his money's going." Jake sighed. "You're sure you want to go down this road?" Jake, I said, my voice steady, I don't have a choice. By the next evening, Jake had what I needed. Kyle's been receiving large deposits from an untraceable account, he explained. Looks like hush money. And guess who else is linked to it? Delaney, I said, already knowing the answer. Bingo. Your brother and your CO are in deep with someone big. My guess? Armando Lowe. They're using you, Nick. Delaney's been keeping tabs on your work, probably feeding Lowe your moves. And Kyle? He's the middleman. It all clicked, the late-night calls, the deleted texts, the strange behavior. They weren't just betraying me, they were undermining everything I stood for. That night, Rachel came to bed late, slipping under the covers without a word. I pretended to sleep, my back to her. She didn't try to talk or touch me, which told me all I needed to know. I lay there, staring at the wall, my mind racing. They thought they were so smart, playing me like a fool. But the game wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The next few days were a blur of routine and restraint. I went to work, smiled when I had to, and let Rachel carry on with her charade. She acted as if nothing was wrong, like we were just another happy couple going through the motions. But I noticed everything, the extra time she spent on her phone, the excuses to run errands, the little slips in her stories. It was almost insulting how careless she was being. I wasn't just waiting. I was preparing. Jake came through again, sending me details on the deposits Kyle had been receiving. The numbers were staggering, more than enough to show he was on Lowe's payroll. Delaney, meanwhile, was working overtime to cover his tracks. But the more they tried to hide, the more they left clues for me to find. What I needed now was proof that Rachel was involved. Not just emotionally, but directly. If she was using me as cover for whatever deal Kyle and Delaney had going, I needed to know. I installed a hidden camera in our living room. Rachel liked to make her calls there when she thought I was at work. It didn't take long to catch something. One afternoon, while I was working late, she sat on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear. "Relax, Kyle," she said, her tone sharp. "Nick doesn't suspect anything." I clenched my fists as I watched the live feed. "I told you," she continued, "I'll handle him. Just make sure Delaney keeps his end of the deal. If this falls apart, we're all screwed." She hung up, tossed her phone on the couch, and ran her hands through her hair. For the first time, I saw a crack in her perfect facade. She looked nervous, almost desperate. Good, I thought. Let her sweat. The next step was harder. I needed to connect Rachel directly to Lowe's operation. That meant stepping into dangerous territory. Jake was reluctant, but he eventually got me access to the department surveillance on Lowe. It didn't take long to find something interesting, a warehouse downtown that was flagged as a potential meeting spot for Lowe's crew. I decided to follow Rachel the next time she ran errands. If she was tied to this, she'd lead me to the answers I needed. Friday night, she left the house around 7 p.m., saying she was meeting friends. I tailed her from a safe distance, my headlights off. She drove across town, not to a restaurant or a friend's house, but straight to the warehouse. My stomach dropped as I watched her car pull into the lot. She got out, looking around nervously, before disappearing inside. This was it. Proof. I parked a block away, slipping out of my car with my camera. The rain had started again, heavy and relentless, but I didn't care. I crept closer, staying low, snapping photos of Rachel entering the building. I didn't know what I'd find inside, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was betrayal on a whole new level. The warehouse loomed in front of me, its walls streaked with rust and grime. Rain poured harder, soaking me to the bone as I crouched behind a stack of crates near the entrance. Rachel had gone inside, and I couldn't shake the image of her slipping through that door like she belonged there. I waited for a few minutes, scanning the lot. 2 men in dark jackets stood by the main entrance, smoking and chatting like they had nowhere better to be. Security. That meant something was happening inside. I needed a way in without being spotted. Circling the building, I found a side door partially ajar. It creaked as I pushed it open, and I winced, praying the noise was drowned out by the rain. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the smell of oil and metal. Rows of shelving units lined the walls, stacked high with crates and barrels. Faint voices carried from deeper inside. I moved quietly, sticking to the shadows, my camera ready. I crept closer until I saw them. Rachel stood in the center of a makeshift office space, surrounded by a few men I didn't recognize, except one. Diego, Armando Lowe's lieutenant, was leaning against a table, flipping through a folder. "Everything's in order," Diego said, his voice low but clear. "You sure you can handle your end?" Rachel nodded, her arms crossed. "Kyle and Delaney have it under control. As long as Nick stays out of the way, we're fine." The room spun for a moment as her words sank in. She wasn't just covering for Kyle. She was actively involved, helping them work with Lowe's people. "Nick's not a problem," Rachel added, almost dismissively. "He's too focused on Diego to see what's really going on." The men chuckled, and I felt my blood boil. I was right in the middle of this investigation, and she was using me as a shield to protect their operation. I steadied my breathing and snapped a few photos, capturing Diego, Rachel, and the others in the same frame. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The meeting wrapped up quickly. Diego handed Rachel a thick envelope, cash probably, and she stuffed it into her bag. As they began to disperse, I slipped back toward the side door, careful not to make a sound. Once outside, I ran to my car, the rain masking my hurried footsteps. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly, my mind racing. They were all in on it, Rachel, Kyle, Delaney. They were working together, not just to betray me, but to undermine the entire case I'd spent months building. I had the proof now. Photos, financial records, and their words ringing in my ears. But I wasn't ready to take it to the department. Not yet. This was personal. And I was going to make every single one of them pay. The rain had finally let up by the time I got home. Rachel's car was already in the driveway, and the lights in the living room were on. She was inside, probably relaxing after her errands, unaware that I had followed her every move. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the house. The place where we built a life together now felt like a facade, a stage where she played her part while scheming behind my back. But not for much longer. Tonight, I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I had learned enough about her games to know she'd spin a story, twist the truth, and try to make me doubt myself. No, I'd let her keep playing innocent, for now. When I walked in, Rachel was on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up with a practiced smile. "Hey, you're home early. How was work?" "Busy," I said, shrugging off my jacket. "Did you eat?" she asked, her tone light and casual, like she didn't just leave a meeting with a criminal. "Grabbed something on the way," I lied. She nodded, glancing back at her phone. The perfect picture of a calm, caring wife. I wondered how she could live with herself, lying so easily. The next day, I called Jake. "I've got enough to tie Rachel to Lowe's crew," I told him. Jake sighed. "Nick, this is getting messy. You're walking a fine line between detective and husband here. Are you sure you can handle both?" "I don't have a choice," I said firmly. "I'm not just going to let this slide." "Fine," Jake said reluctantly. "What's the plan?" "I need a way to draw them all out, Rachel, Kyle, and Delaney. Somewhere I can control the narrative, catch them red-handed. We've got enough to link them to Lowe, but I want them to incriminate themselves fully." Jake paused. "You're talking about a setup." "Exactly." Over the next few days, I laid the groundwork. Jake helped me quietly pull some strings, redirecting suspicion away from the ongoing investigation so I could act without tipping anyone off. I planted fake intel in my case logs, suggesting a shipment tied to Lowe's operation would be arriving at a dock in the industrial district. If Kyle and Delaney were feeding Lowe information, this would get their attention. If Rachel was as deeply involved as I thought, she'd make sure she was there too. It was a gamble, but it was my best shot at forcing their hands. That Friday, I came home to find Rachel getting dressed for a girls' night. She stood in front of the mirror, fixing her hair, her back to me. "You working late again?" she asked, meeting my eyes in the mirror's reflection. "Yeah," I said, pulling on my jacket. "Big night for the case." Her smile faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. "Be careful," she said, her tone sweet. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. Inside, I was seething. She wasn't going to a girls' night, and I knew it. Later that evening, I parked in a secluded spot near the dock, hidden but with a clear view of the warehouse where the fake shipment was supposed to arrive. It didn't take long for the players to show up. First was Kyle, stepping out of his car and scanning the area nervously. Then came Rachel, wearing a hooded coat and clutching her bag tightly. Last was Delaney, his presence confirming everything I'd suspected. They gathered near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear them, but it didn't matter. I had what I needed, Rachel and Kyle meeting with Delaney at the site of a shipment tied to Armando Lowe. It was all falling into place. As they moved into the warehouse, I followed from a distance, camera in hand. My heart pounded as I snapped photos, documenting every step they took. Inside, they found the crates I'd planted, empty of course. Confusion flashed across their faces, and I could almost hear them realizing something was off. That's when I stepped out of the shadows. Looking for something? I asked, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. All three of them froze, their eyes locking on me. Nick. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale. Surprise, I said coldly, holding up my camera. Smile for the evidence. The trap was sprung. And now, it was time for answers. The warehouse was silent, except for the rain pattering on the roof. Rachel, Kyle, and Delaney stared at me, frozen like deer caught in headlights. For once, they didn't have quick words or smug excuses. Nick, what are you doing here? Rachel finally managed, her voice shaky. Funny, I said, stepping closer. I was about to ask you the same thing. I gestured toward the crates. Expecting a shipment? Delaney's face hardened. You've got the wrong idea, Carter. This isn't what it looks like. Oh, I'm sure it isn't, I said, holding up my camera. But this? This looks exactly like what I needed. Kyle took a step forward, raising his hands like he could somehow calm the situation. Nick, let's talk about this. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I snapped, cutting him off. You've been feeding Lowe information, haven't you? Working with Delaney, with Rachel. Using me to cover your tracks. All while lying to my face. Kyle flinched but didn't deny it. His silence said everything. Rachel looked between me and Kyle, her expression desperate. Nick, listen to me. It's not what you think. I didn't want to be a part of this, but... Don't, I said sharply, my voice cold enough to make her stop. Don't stand there and lie to me. Not after everything. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. Delaney, meanwhile, was already trying to take control. Carter, you need to think carefully about your next move, he said, his voice steady. You've got a lot to lose here. Let's handle this quietly. No one needs to know. I almost laughed. You think I'm going to let this go? After what you've done? After what you've all done? I shook my head. No. This ends here. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could see them scrambling for a way out, a way to spin the situation in their favor. But there wasn't one. I had them cornered, and they knew it. You should have been honest, I said, my voice low but firm. But now? Now you're going to pay for every lie, every betrayal. Rachel's lip trembled as she opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and walked out, leaving them behind. I wasn't done with them yet. But the next move was mine. The drive home was quiet, the rain still falling softly. My mind churned as I replayed their faces, Rachel's shock, Kyle's guilt, Delaney's calculated calm. They weren't just scrambling to cover their tracks, they were panicked, exposed. This wasn't just a betrayal anymore. It was a game of survival. The next morning, Rachel tried to act normal. She poured coffee and sat across from me at the table, her usual bright smile forced and strained. Morning, she said, her voice a little too cheerful. I didn't reply, just stared at her, letting the silence stretch. She finally broke, her hands gripping her mug tightly. Nick, about last night. What about it? I said flatly, setting down my fork. Her breath hitched. You shouldn't have been there. You're misunderstanding things. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. Am I? Then explain it to me. Explain why you're sneaking around with Kyle and Delaney at a warehouse tied to Armando Lowe. Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked like she might try to deny it. Then her shoulders sagged. I didn't have a choice, she whispered. Didn't have a choice? I repeated, anger bubbling under the surface. You always have a choice, Rachel. You chose this. She reached across the table, her hand trembling. Nick, I never meant to hurt you. It got out of control. Kyle, he dragged me into it. Delaney threatened me. I didn't know how to get out. I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. Save it, Rachel. You've been lying for months. Don't act like you're some innocent victim now. The rest of the day was tense. Rachel hovered around the house, watching me carefully, probably trying to figure out what I was planning. I didn't give her any clues. I didn't need to. Later that evening, Jake called. They're moving fast, he said. Kyle's been making calls all day, trying to clean things up. Delaney's on edge too, probably figuring out how to save his own skin. And Rachel? I asked, though I already knew. She's playing it quiet, Jake replied. But if I were you, I'd watch my back. She's not as helpless as she looks. After hanging up, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the photos on my phone. Proof of their betrayal, of the web they'd woven behind my back. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the next day, the cracks were starting to show. Rachel avoided me completely, staying locked in the bedroom for most of the morning. Kyle left me 3 voicemails, his voice frantic, practically begging me to call him back. I didn't. Delaney, though? He made his move. Around noon, I was at my desk at the precinct when he walked in, casual as ever, but I could see the tension in his eyes. He didn't even wait for me to look up before closing the door behind him. "We need to talk, Carter," he said, his tone clipped. "About what?" I asked, keeping my face neutral. "You've been poking around in places you don't belong," Delaney said, crossing his arms. "Digging into things that don't concern you." I raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't concern me?" "Funny, because it seems to involve my wife, my brother, and my case." Delaney leaned in, his voice dropping. "This isn't a fight you want, Carter. You're a good cop, but you're out of your depth. Let it go, and I can make sure you come out of this clean. Keep pushing, and it won't end well for you." I leaned back in my chair, meeting his gaze. "You sound nervous, Captain. That's not like you." He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. "Consider this a warning." After he left, I sat there, the weight of his words settling over me. He wasn't bluffing. Delaney had power, connections. If he wanted to, he could bury me professionally and personally. But he didn't know me as well as he thought. I'd already decided there was no turning back. That night, I stayed in the living room, nursing a glass of bourbon and waiting. Rachel finally came downstairs around 9 p.m., her expression cautious. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I gestured to the chair across from me. "Go ahead." She hesitated, then sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I know you're angry," she began, her voice trembling. "But I need you to understand, I didn't do this to hurt you." "You didn't," I said coldly. "Then why do it at all?" She looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "Kyle," he said, "it was harmless at first. Just helping Delaney with a few things. But then it got bigger. He got involved with Lowe's people, and I didn't know how to stop it." "You could have told me," I said sharply. "But instead you lied. You covered for them." "I was scared," she snapped, her composure breaking. "They said if I told you, it would destroy you. I was trying to protect you." I scoffed. "Protect me? You're working with the very people I've been trying to take down for months. Don't act like you're some selfless hero in this." She started crying, burying her face in her hands, but I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. As she sat there, sobbing, my phone buzzed. A text from Jake. "Lowe's people are moving. Kyle just left his place in a hurry. Want me to follow?" I stared at Rachel, still crying across from me. Then I texted back, "No. I'll handle it myself." It was time to confront Kyle, and end this once and for all. I knew exactly where to find Kyle. When things got heated, he always went to the same place, our late father's old cabin, tucked away on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, isolated, and more importantly, the perfect spot for a guilty man to hide. The drive out there was long and tense, the road winding through dark woods. My mind raced with every mile. What was I going to say? Would he even try to deny it, or was this the moment he'd finally come clean? When I pulled up, Kyle's car was parked out front, the headlights off but the engine still warm. Inside, the lights were on, and through the window, I saw him pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. I killed my engine and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots echoing in the quiet night. I didn't knock. I walked in. Kyle spun around, his phone slipping from his hand when he saw me. "Nick," he stammered, his face pale. "Relax," I said, closing the door behind me. Just here to talk. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he shoved them into his pockets. Look, I know what you think, but it's not what it looks like. Don't insult me, Kyle, I said, my voice low and even. I've seen the bank transfers. I followed Rachel to the warehouse. I heard the two of you talking. Kyle's shoulders sagged, the weight of his lies finally catching up to him. Nick, I didn't want this, he said, his voice cracking. Delaney came to me months ago. Said he needed someone to pass along information, keep things under control. He promised it would be easy money, no risk. And you believed him? I asked, taking a step closer. Kyle laughed bitterly. Of course not. But I was desperate, okay? My business was failing. I was drowning in debt. Then Lowe's people got involved, and everything spiraled. I stared at him, the brother I thought I knew, and felt a mix of anger and pity. And Rachel? I asked. What's her excuse? She didn't know at first, Kyle admitted, looking away. But when Delaney threatened to pull you into it, I panicked. I told her everything and begged her to help me keep you out of it. She didn't keep me out of it, I snapped. She dragged me into it, lied to my face, and used me as cover while the two of you worked with Lowe. Kyle flinched but didn't argue. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Then I took a step closer, my voice steady and cold. This ends tonight, Kyle. No more games, no more lies. You're going to tell me everything, every deal, every name, every detail you've kept from me. Kyle hesitated, his face twisting in fear. Nick, if I talk, Delaney will kill me. Lowe will kill me. They'll come after you too. I leaned in, my gaze piercing. They should be scared of me, not the other way around. Kyle stared at me, his resolve crumbling. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. I'll tell you everything. I pulled out my phone, hitting record. Start talking. Kyle took a shaky breath and began to unravel the tangled web of corruption and betrayal. Every word he said brought me closer to the truth, and closer to the moment when I could finally bring all of them down. Kyle sat down heavily on the old couch, rubbing his temples like the weight of it all might crush him. It started small, he began, his voice trembling. Delaney approached me about keeping tabs on you. He said it was to make sure Lowe's people weren't targeting you directly. And you believed that? I asked, keeping my tone cold. Kyle gave a bitter laugh. Not really. But he offered money, real money. I needed it. Then it escalated. Lowe's crew started using me to pass messages. Delaney made sure I got paid, but he kept most of it. That's when I realized he wasn't just protecting Lowe, he was working for him. And Rachel? I pressed. Kyle hesitated, glancing at the floor. I brought her in after Delaney started asking about your case. He was worried you were getting too close to Lowe. Rachel thought, if she could distract you, keep you off their trail. She betrayed me, I cut in, my voice sharp. Kyle winced but nodded. Yeah, she did. She thought she was protecting you, Nick. But it got out of control. I stared at him, my fists clenched. And Lowe? What's his connection to Delaney? They're partners, Kyle said grimly. Delaney feeds him intel, keeps the heat off his operations. Lowe pays him a cut of every major deal. And you? I asked. Kyle shook his head. I was just a pawn. Delaney kept me in line, and when I pushed back, he threatened to bring you down too. Said he'd pin it all on you if I didn't cooperate. The room fell silent as Kyle's words hung in the air. Everything I'd suspected, every doubt, every betrayal, it was all worse than I'd imagined. You're going to testify, I said finally. Give me everything on Delaney and Lowe. If you don't, I leaned in, lowering my voice, I'll make sure you pay for every single lie you've told me. Kyle nodded weakly. Okay, Nick. I'll do it. Just, be careful. Delaney's dangerous, and Lowe, he's ruthless. They'll come after you. I straightened, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Let them try. As I walked out of the cabin, the pieces of my plan began to fall into place. Kyle's confession was just the beginning. Now it was time to take down Delaney, and let Rachel see the cost of choosing the wrong side. The next morning, I sent Kyle's confession to Jake. His response came back almost immediately. This is it, Nick. Delaney's done. Lowe too, if we play it right. But I wasn't ready to take it to the department just yet. I needed to make sure there were no gaps, No way for Delaney or Lowe to wiggle out of this. I had to force them into a corner where there was no escape. Rachel stayed quiet, avoiding me like a shadow in the house. I let her. Confronting her now would only tip my hand. Instead, I focused on the plan. Jake helped coordinate. We leaked a rumor through Kyle. One final shipment was being moved through the docks that night. Delaney and Lowe couldn't resist a last grab at profit. If everything worked as I expected, they'd both show up to oversee it personally. And Rachel? I wasn't sure, but I had a feeling she wouldn't be far behind. By the time night fell, I was in position, hidden in an old shipping container near the dock. Jake and a small team of trusted officers were stationed nearby, ready to move in when the time was right. Around 9 p.m., Delaney's car pulled up, sleek and black. He stepped out, his eyes scanning the area, his demeanor tense. A second car arrived minutes later, and Lowe emerged, flanked by 2 enforcers. Watching them stand side by side, I felt the weight of it all, the months of lies, the careers they destroyed, the lives they'd ruined. But tonight, that ended. The moment that caught my breath came shortly after. Another car rolled in, and Rachel stepped out. She wore a long coat, her face pale under the harsh dock lights. She approached Delaney, who gestured toward Lowe, clearly explaining something. I snapped photos, my hand steady despite the rage boiling inside me. This was it, Rachel standing with the men who had been tearing apart my life. Jake's voice crackled in my earpiece. "We move now." "Not yet," I whispered. "Wait until the exchange." It didn't take long. Lowe handed Delaney a black duffel bag, cash, no doubt. Rachel watched silently, her arms crossed tightly. It was clear now, she wasn't an innocent bystander. She was in this deep. I gave Jake the signal. The takedown was swift and brutal. Officers swarmed the dock from every direction, shouting commands. Delaney and Lowe tried to run, but it was useless. Jake tackled Delaney himself, pinning him to the ground. Lowe's enforcers put up a fight, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Rachel froze as the chaos erupted around her, her eyes locking on mine as I stepped out of the shadows. "Nick," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You should have stayed out of it," I said coldly, watching as an officer cuffed her. Tears streamed down her face as she was led away. For a moment, I felt something, pain, regret, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice. As Delaney was dragged past me, his eyes burned with fury. "You think this is over, Carter," he spat. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." I didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." With Lowe, Delaney, and Rachel in custody, the night felt heavier than I expected. Victory didn't taste sweet. It just felt empty. The people I'd trusted most had betrayed me. And now, they'd face the consequences. The next morning, I sat alone in the precinct, staring at the stack of reports in front of me. Delaney, Lowe, and their crew were booked. Rachel, too. Kyle had agreed to testify in exchange for leniency, and Jake was already pulling the files needed to secure airtight cases. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Rachel's confession replayed in my mind, the way her voice cracked as they cuffed her. "I didn't want it to end like this," she'd said. But she'd made her choices. They all had. Kyle, my own brother, had turned on me for money. Delaney had exploited everyone, using his badge to shield a criminal empire. And Rachel, she betrayed the life we'd built. Jake walked in, breaking the silence. "You good?" he asked, handing me a coffee. I nodded slowly. "What happens next?" "Delaney's going away for a long time," Jake said. "Lowe too. As for Rachel, that's up to the DA." I nodded, but I already knew I wouldn't fight for leniency. She wasn't just my wife, she'd become part of the enemy. When I got home that night, the house was eerily quiet. Her things were still there, but it felt like a stranger had lived in those walls. I sat on the couch, staring at the photos I'd taken. Proof of their betrayal. Proof I'd done the right thing.